Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to keynote number two of Generation Analog 2026. Um, our second keynote speaker is Matteo Menapace, who is coming to us live from London in the United Kingdom, and we're in this case particularly grateful for our sponsors at Asmodee Gaming Lab, who has provided us with two excellent sign language interpreters for our keynote lecture today. And I would now like to introduce Matteo to you. Before then, Matteo has a um, full talk to engage you on basically capitalism and its design spaces. Matteo Menapace designs cooperative games and facilitates playful workshops for people to explore real-world challenges. He lectures in game design and was game designer in residence at the V&A, that's the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Matteo co-designed Daybreak, a cooperative game about stopping climate breakdown, which then won the Spiel des Jahres award for Best Connoisseur Game in 2024. However, he was banned by the award jury for wearing a Palestine solidarity symbol during the ceremony. And of course, to end, Matteo is a very serious game designer. Without further delay, please welcome Matteo Menapace.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. And before I start, actually, I would like to shout out to some of the people that presented today and yesterday because they kind of anticipated some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So Simon and Peter, as well as Biz earlier, and Prasad and Linda, Jerome and Gabrielle yesterday for mentioning Daybreak. And now I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to talk about Daybreak mostly today. But before we talk about Daybreak, I would like to ask everyone a question and respond in the Discord chat what your answer might be. So what is the game that I'm showing you in the slides right there? What is it called? And please respond into Discord and tell me what you think that is. Okay, someone already has guessed it. Someone said chess, but it's not chess. It is capitalism, of course. And capitalism is the game that we play every day, whether we like it or not. It's of course a political system, an economic system that relentlessly turns everything and everyone into a profit-making opportunity. And in a metaphorical sense, capitalism is the water that we swim in. So we're so immersed in it, then we often forget about it. And we forget that capitalism shapes the way we think about what is possible, what is plausible, and even what is desirable. So you might think of free education, that's not realistic. Free healthcare, get real. Clean air and water, not going to have it. Economic democracy, impossible. So this capitalist footprint on our collective imagination is called capitalist realism, as we've heard earlier today. And it spreads the sense that our current system is the only possible way to organize society, and also that it is impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. Or, in other words, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So this shapes, of course, also the way that we think about games, the way that we play, that we design, and that we understand games. In capitalism, games are mostly entertainment products. And so games are often about abstract and fictional themes. But they don't have to be. They can also be used to model and to critique real-world systems. For instance, as we've seen before, Monopoly, or rather the landlord's game. Monopoly is a capitalist fantasy where you build your property, empire, and you bankrupt everyone in the process. But before it became Monopoly, it was designed as a serious game to demonstrate the problems with the capitalist system and to model an alternative system to it. Or in Elizabeth McGee's words, a practical demonstration of the present system of land grabbing in which alternative approaches to property ownership can lead to vastly different social outcomes. So, as many of you may know, Elizabeth McGee designed a game called The Landlord's Game, which had two different sets of rules, which could be played on the same board. One was competitive, called Monopolist, and that was to demonstrate the problems with capitalism. And those rules encourage players to hoard properties by charging rent until one player bankrupted everyone else. And every game would start from this competitive mode, and then players could decide at any point to switch to the other mode, the cooperative set of rules called Prosperity, in which everyone succeeded together. So under the Prosperity rules, instead of paying rent to a landlord, you would pay a tax to Treasury, which would use that money to buy up services like the schools, the railways, and so on, and then to redistribute the rest to every player. And this was designed to reflect the policy of taxing wealth and the value of land, and then redistributing it across society. So the Landlord's Game was designed in 1902, more or less, and in 1935, the Landlord's Game was plagiarized into Monopoly. And when that happened, the cooperative rules were scrapped, and what McGee identified as the problem became the goal of the game, the capitalist fantasy of becoming the monopolist. So, like Monopoly, most games foster this kind of zero-sum competition between players where I win and therefore you lose. But when we play a competitive game, we are consumed by this experience of trying to outsmart the other players, and that can be very fun, but also it can lead us to sometimes miss the bigger picture. When we play a cooperative game instead, we can talk to the other players, we can discuss ideas, we can discuss strategies, and collectively we can address systemic challenges, such as a pandemic. So this is a game called Pandemic, in which players fight the spread of 4 deadly viruses across the world, and they move their special characters in various cities, trying to manage infections in the short term, and in the long term, they're trying to collect and share information that might lead to a cure. So you win altogether, it's cooperative, if you find cures for all the 4 viruses. You lose instead if the outbreaks of viruses get out of control and completely overwhelm you. So Pandemic teaches us how important cooperation and communication is when it comes to pushing back against this powerful systemic enemy. And the lesson really is that we can't win alone. So when a real pandemic happened in 2020, I wrote a blog post about this and I published it on Medium. And then a few days later, I discovered that Matt Leacock, the author of Pandemic that I didn't know at the time, wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times on a similar topic. So I reached out to him on what was then known as Twitter, and we started a conversation. So Matt replied to me, and he noticed that I was interested also in another big problem that humanity is facing, the climate crisis. He had done some research about a game on the climate crisis, so he said, why don't we have a chat about it? So we organized a call, which then turned into a weekly chat, which turned into a project, and 3 years later, we published Daybreak. So in those early chats, we identified 3 ideas that then became our guiding principles throughout the whole design process. And I would like to focus on those 3 ideas for the rest of the talk. So the first thing we agreed on was that we're historically past the point of raising awareness about the problem of climate change. That's a fact that has been acknowledged even by the oil industry. So the real question is a political one. It's about what to do about this big problem and what kind of solutions should we pursue. And this is good for our medium of choice because games are the art of agency, right? So they're about people doing stuff, solving problems, or at least simulating solving problems. So we agreed that our game should frame the climate crisis as a systemic problem that is driven by capitalism, the system that turns everything and everyone into a resource to be extracted, to be exploited, and to be profited from. And if the problem is global and systemic, then so should be the solutions. There is a UN document called Making Peace with Nature from 2021, states that we need a system-wide transformation, a fundamental change in the technological, economic, and social organization of our world. This is a UN document that's as close as it gets to the UN saying that capitalism needs to go if we want to have a chance at solving the climate crisis. And it's also frustrating when climate crisis and climate action is promoted as a matter of personal choices. So eating less meat, flying less, maybe having less or no kids. And those are all potentially transformative personal experiences and choices. But we didn't want to design a game that tells players that reducing your personal carbon footprint is enough to match the scale and the urgency of the climate crisis. Also, because the idea of a personal carbon footprint was pushed by the marketing of an oil company, BP, British Petroleum, so that you obsess with your tiny personal emissions and you distract your attention from the 73% of emissions that the oil industry facilitates worldwide. So this idea around a systemic frame helped us answer also the question of who or what would the players represent. So in Daybreak, each player takes on the role of a state or a group of states, and we chose states because they are the entities that are capable of meeting the scale of the challenge, and also because they can take risks than private organizations will not. So before I explain the choice of how we split up the world into 4 different factions, I would like to acknowledge our positionality. So we are a team of mostly white men from weird, as in Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic countries in the global north. So the game is in some ways a product of our socio-political context. Now, in the game, you can play as the US, China, Europe, or the majority world. The US is this hyper-capitalist state, and by that I mean not only a capitalist state, but one that is determined to export and to impose capitalism on the rest of the world. And from a climate perspective, historically the US is the biggest polluter, so the biggest emitter of carbon emissions, and also currently the biggest exporter of fossil fuels. Then we have China, which is mostly a socialist state that participates in the capitalist world economy. It is the factory of the world and is currently the biggest emitter of carbon emissions, but also is a state that is building and installing more clean energy than the rest of the world combined. So a very important player in the climate game. Then we have Europe, which is the birthplace of capitalism, and not quite a state, but a coalition of states that have similar histories and similar economies. And last but not least, the majority world, which is also known as the Global South. We used to call it the Global South, and then someone from the Global South told us maybe we should call it majority world because it better expresses what it is. And it is indeed the majority of people in the world that are the least responsible for the climate crisis, but also the most affected by the consequences of the climate crisis. So in the game, you're in charge of a state or a group of states, and your starting political economy is based on real current data, which leads to the second principle. Realism. So we try to embed realism on two levels. On the problems level, so the emissions that you have to reduce across all sectors of the economy are based on current emissions levels, and also the crises that you're facing are happening already in real life. And then on the solutions level, the cards that you play are based on existing technologies and policies, not on science fiction. So to give you a quick sample, a small sample of them, there are about 50 crisis cards in Daybreak. This is a small sample, and each round the game will trigger a series of crises that go from the type of extreme weather events that we associate with the climate crisis, so floods and storms and heat waves, to the knock-on effects that those can have combined with chronic issues that you may have across the world. So, for instance, droughts or floods that lead to food shortages, that lead to famine, that leads to social unrest, that might lead to an economic crisis, that might lead to eco-fascist government, for instance. All of that you can experience in Daybreak. Then on the solutions side, again, a small sample of about 150 cards that you can experience in the game. These are a combination of bold, radical policy cards, and they cover a spectrum of different policies. So from what climate people would call mitigation, so tackling the problem at its roots, so reducing emissions across your economy through electrification of industry, transport, energy, and so on, and also policies that represent adaptation, which is the building of resilience across your societies, across your ecosystems and infrastructures. And the deck also includes some solutions that could be considered, or are actually controversial, like nuclear energy or geoengineering, so the idea of spraying the atmosphere, the stratosphere, with gas that would reflect the sun rays and artificially reduce the temperatures on Earth, which I personally wouldn't like to see happening in the real world, but that we decided to include because these are seriously being taken into consideration, and we may see them at some point in the near future. So having them in the game means that players have the opportunity to try out and explore the risks and the potential outcomes of those technologies. Now, the game is realistic in terms of emissions, in terms of crises, in terms of policies, but there are a couple of assumptions that we're making which are definitely not realistic and more utopian. The first one is that states are taking the climate crisis seriously, and the second assumption is that states are cooperating to solve it. So we have this realistic model combined with a utopian set of assumptions, which creates what we learned you could call a Possitopia. So a place for players to explore what is possible. And these three principles, the systemic frame, realism, and Possitopia, are embedded in the win and lose conditions that will constrain what people are going to do when playing. So the game is cooperative, not because you're forced to work together, but because you can lose altogether. So that red line in the graph is what you could say as the path to dystopia. So you've got global emissions that are rising, and with that they raise global temperatures. Those global temperatures set an increasing number of crises that then can make you lose the game. You lose the game in three ways. You lose if it gets too hot, so if temperatures reach a certain level, 2 degrees of pre-industrial global warming. If it gets too late, so if you haven't won by the end of the 6th round, or more likely, if one of the players has descended into social collapse. So if the crisis that happen or that are exacerbated by the climate crisis lead one player to social collapse. That's the most likely way to lose the game. And it happens, only one player needs to be in that position. And that really binds everyone together. So if one player fails, everyone fails. On the other hand, you win Daybreak by flattening the emission curve. So if the cumulative emissions start going down, so you reach that point of drawdown before the end of the sixth round, then you win the game. And there isn't a single strategy that works all the time. So winning is about balance, it's about transitioning the global economy away from fossil fuels, but at the same time you must take care of societies, you must take care of your ecosystems, infrastructures, and build resilience to make sure that you don't lose. So the green line is the path to a world transformed, which is scarred by the climate crisis. It's not quite utopia, but is one that is also probably a post-capitalist world. So what is the point of this post-utopian game? And I would like to circle back to capitalist realism and the idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So the antidote to that imagination paralysis, the antidote to capitalist realism, is not utopia, because I feel that would lead us to wishful thinking, and it's not dystopia, which would lead us to a sense of despair, but it's this somewhere in between, is this playful space between dystopia and post-utopia, where players can explore a detailed, active, radical, and shared imagination of what is possible. And to conclude, another slide with 3 things on them. So the first one is a link to learn more about Daybreak, blog.daybreakgame.org. The second link is a game I've been working on, which is a shorter, smaller, and simpler version of Daybreak in a single deck of cards called Dawn. And then Games Transformed, which is a festival of political games that I'm co-organizing. It's happening in London at the end of October. So if you're around, please come to Games Transformed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matteo. And I think I echo the participants of this conference to say that this was a wonderful participation, presentation that signifies all of the importance that a simple board game may carry in our current moment. All right, if we can move on to the Q&A. If we could stop sharing the screen, and we'll move right into the question and answer period.
If I can leave the screen up for a bit, so maybe people can take notes
Absolutely. Yeah,
of the links.
let's do that, but then also we can get the links into the Discord.
Yeah.
And so I guess I will start with a personal anecdote, which is to say, Amanda Webb, our civil engineer professor at the University of Cincinnati, played Daybreak several years ago and was so inspired by it and also saddened by it that she chose to make her own um, board game in which civil engineers can look at more sustainable engineering and architecture, especially in building design. And it's called Let's Decarbonize. This is not so much a plug for the game as it is for, because again, it's really designed for engineers, not for random, gamer hobby enthusiasts. But it is a example of the fact that game design is a conversation. You made a very important, sort of entry into this conversation, and that then I think people who could do something said, "Cool, I'm going to make another communicative instrument that will perhaps then be very focused on a solution." So then when we can find. So, thank you for doing that. The other thing is, of course, I'm in the house with several other board game enthusiasts. They've all played Daybreak, and they played it exactly once. because they found it too depressing. So I'm going to, come into this with my opening question, which is, how have people responded to this game? And what do you do with this sort of mixture of emotions? I mean, obviously you see yourself in a longer continuity with serious game designers like Lizzie McGee, but then, you're charting your own path here in the 21st century as well.
Yeah, great question. So there's a mixture of feelings, of course, that emerge when playing Daybreak. Some people have described it as a bittersweet experience, even when you win the game, and as your colleague also has experienced, there can be a set of negative emotions that come up when you don't win the game. Because, like I said, the game is trying to be realistic in that it presents you with the possibility of of a loss, and that loss is based on the current trajectory that we're on. So we didn't want to shy away from the fact that as a global society we are on track for very rough time, and that part of the experience of the radical imagination is um, to also see what could happen, even if it's in a playful space. So there is there is certainly that, and I think when players have that experience, what I've found works really well is to open up a conversations. And I typically ask people, for instance, after a game, how how did I feel, whether they won or whether they lost, and that experience of sharing your feelings and to make them kind of social is a way to also normalize what some people call eco anxiety or eco grief. That is increasingly something that we're experiencing in the real world as well. So yeah, I think it's important not to shy away from those feelings. But of course, there is also the fact that this is an entertainment product. I mean, it's a product that you can buy in board games shops and play online on BGA. So it is also trying to bring in that element of gaming. And um, for that, I I don't have much experience of people that only played it once. Like, or I don't know, maybe I'm biased, but when people play and lose Daybreak, they generally go away with the feeling that they want to play again. They want to have another go, and that's the beauty of a game is the fact that if you lost, you can try again. If you can try and do differently next time. And it's one of the things that we've been talking a lot about during the design process. It's the idea of when people lose, and the game is tuned to be lost more likely than it is to be won on your first game. That's quite a general rule of thumb, I would say, of cooperative games. But if you lose, are you going to blame yourself or are you going to blame the game? Because if you're going to blame yourself and your choices, that means that you can see the possibility of making different choices and therefore winning. If you're going to blame the game, then you probably think that the game is unwinnable. So we paid a lot of attention during playtests about how would people process a loss, both emotionally and kind of cognitively, and would they blame themselves, which is what we try to design for. So make in a way that the game feels winnable or feels possible, even when you lost.
All right, I currently have four questions already lined up. Again, if you've got a question, I would say your best bet because I've got. I mean, I've seen Brian's in the Discord as well as those over here on Zoom. So I will actually begin with these in the Q&A box on Zoom, and then move to Brian and Ed's questions. So Camila Zamboni writes, considering the praxis gap that was discussed yesterday in Jérôme Legris-Paget's talk. What are some of the ways you have seen Daybreak inform or be included in conversations, projects that are praxis oriented, if any? What are some that surprised you?
That's a great question. And I'm kind of doing a PhD about that at the moment, so I'm at
Okay.
the very early stages. But this question of how you turn something that is simulated and imaginative to something that could be more embedded in real work or praxis really interests me, and I think that uh, also going back to what Jerome was saying yesterday, we shouldn't uh, we shouldn't think or delude ourselves with the thought that games in themselves can do all of that work. Like the game in itself is not going to be a transformative object. Um, but I think it's the people around the table and the context in which the game is played, which can lead to a change of attitudes and potentially can be part of a wider kind of pipeline of activism or political work. So I think the first step is to acknowledge that games by themselves don't change people, but it is the people that you play games with that might change you. So one thing that Daybreak can do and other similar games can do is to bring certain conversations to the table, and maybe that can happen in education. I've seen lots of interest in people that want to bring Daybreak into the classroom. Um, but it's also about normalizing certain conversations outside of the classroom and to shift the focus, as I was saying before, from arguing about whether climate change is real or not to the kind of political questions around what should be done to solve the climate crisis, to try and solve it. And Daybreak, of course, has a very top top level overview of that because in the real world you're unlikely to be the president of the US or anyone who has that kind of power in any of the other factions that you play in Daybreak. So it's not necessarily to like simulate or to put you in the position that you can then play or train for things that you would do in the real world. But it's again to create that imagination and to activate that imagination and to put you in that position where you can say, okay, what would happen if we had a government that actually cared about solving this problem or that wanted to really tackle this, and that can be useful to filter the political discourse and what we hear in the news, for instance. I found myself doing that quite a lot, but also I've heard people telling me, "Oh, okay, that announcement from XYZ politician just felt kind of interesting at first, but then through the lens of what it would do in Daybreak, I realized that it was just greenwashing or it wasn't actually a solution, but it would just be a continuation of business as usual." So it can also provide that mental model for people to apply to global political events and choices.
Right. Thank you. Then we'll do the other Q&A that in the Zoom. Ali asks, how long did it take to design the game and how many playtest sessions did you do to get to where you think the game was ready to go, both in terms of game design, the mechanic, as well as the goal of the game and the message it should deliver?
Yeah. So we started in April 2020, and the game was published in autumn, fall 2023. So technically 2 years and a half. But the core of the game design was done by the end of 2021. So I would say between a year and a half and 2 years to do the design. And I don't know how many playtests we did, but probably in the order of magnitude of hundreds. Um, and those were split between playtests that we did in person. So I would facilitate the playtest, or Matt would facilitate the playtest, play the game ourselves, and then observe other people playing, to the so-called blind playtest, although it's not blind in any sense. But it's the idea that you give someone a full prototype, including the rulebook, and then you ask them to record themselves, ideally on video, so that you can then watch their whole game experience. And we did quite a few of those, I would say probably 20 of those playtests. And this is a great way to learn how people make sense of a game, how people learn how to play, and then how they also talk about the game while they're playing and after they're playing. And they're going to forget that they're recording themselves quite quickly, so you get a really genuine, kind of unfiltered stream of data that you can then analyze and work on. So that is part of what Matt has been doing for a long time. So he has a background in user experience design, and so he brought that into the design of the game, and it was really really a rigorous, time consuming, but also very important part of the process in terms of playtesting. And then to go back to the question, we felt that the game started to click when we removed money from the prototype. So at some point we had two currencies in the game, one that represented money and one that represented political power. And this goes back to the idea of trying to make a realistic game. So the way that policies are being talked about in the media or in political circles is, how much does it cost, how much support does it have, and how can we make it happen? And so we tried to map that to game mechanics, and that we pushed that prototype and that model for quite a few months. And then at some point we had to realize that it wasn't actually working, it was too clunky and time consuming, and it kind of shifted the focus away from actually making decisions, and it was more about budgeting resources. So I think it was at some point in February 2021 that we decided to scrap these two currencies and to instead use cards as currency. So in order to play a card, in order to do an action, you would have to sacrifice a card from your hand. So you have to make this really tense, difficult choices between, I don't know, do you want to do public transport, or do you want to fund your next clean power plant? And that meant that the game became much sharper and shorter, but also the type of decisions that people were asked to do moved away from this kind of budgetary thinking to more political thinking about what are the priorities, what are the core benefits of different things, and how can we make all of this system change happen.
Well, along the lines of the design, Brian McKenzie asks, he says the game is visually appealing, the design of the cards, the aesthetic of the artwork. How important were those considerations in the design process? And how important have the visuals been in helping the game succeed commercially and critically?
Mm, yeah, it was the the visual design was very important, and I think that goes hand in hand with the whole branding and visual direction. So when we were approached by CMYK, the publisher, and at the time, we're talking about early 2021, the prototype was called Climate Crisis. So that's, the problem that you're trying to solve. And as we started working with CMYK, we did a whole naming exploration, and one of the ideas that we were exploring was something around something positive, first of all, because the climate crisis is the problem, of course, that you're trying to solve, but it's not a positive name in itself. So something that feels more positive, something that feels more active, and also something that creates a break with the past. So we wanted to create this contrast between the current business as usual path that we're on and a new set of political economic realities. So that's where Daybreak really emerged as a name, because it has all of these elements of course, the sun, which is a source of energy, the start of a new day, and also the break into in that word that signifies that rupture with the past. So that's where the whole rebranding, I would say, started. And then Alex from CMYK did a great job at pulling different visual inspirations and then putting together like a big board of colors and illustrations, and we we explored the way that this game could create that space for people to imagine a different world. So we wanted the game to have overall a hopeful aesthetic. So you'll see that there's lots of very like warm colors, for instance, or scenes of people doing stuff in the project cards. So in the cards that you play as solutions, there's always a human presence. We always wanted to show that this is the future, but it's also something that could happen tomorrow. Like we kind of wanted to move away from science fiction or something distant. Whereas the crisis cards have a much darker tone, and also there is much more distant when it comes to the illustration. So that was also a choice of like creating also a bit of that emotional distance between what you're seeing in the cards, what the card represents, and how that might affect you both as a player and as a person.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go to Ed's question in the chat over here. And Ed is written, given the weird framework again, Western educated, individual, rich, Democrat, which is important, would you further address what would you call the fourth faction as, what would you call majority world, the rest of the world, and perhaps imagine an expansion that might break that faction into other representative chunks? And I see in the spirit of this question also earlier presentations on dealing with local communities and local histories and local activist strategies.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That's a possibility. And I mean, the majority world is an interesting faction to play, because if you play Daybreak, you know that it's the hardest, it's the most challenging, because it starts at a disadvantage. It's already like 1/4 of the way to lose the game in terms of communities in crisis, and it has this growth rate which is baked into the system model. That means that you have to start producing clean energy from the very beginning, in a way that other factions don't have to worry about it so much. So it is an attempt to show both the the way that the how exposed the majority world is to the climate crisis, and also to show the opportunities that exist there in terms of what people call leapfrogging the industrial development that happened in the global north. So being able to directly go towards a more sustainable green economy and skipping most of the things that created the climate crisis in the first place. But yeah, at the same time, there is definitely quite a lot of generalizations that go into sort of lumping the majority of the world into one single group. So I can see the potential of having expansions or ways to play that are more regionalized, or ways to play that um, create different, more variety, more nuance in that system.
Yeah. Thank you. And again, we have a question from Teray McQueen, which is related to the activism or praxis dimension of this. So it's a really fascinating thing to hear and connect with a lot of the primary framework from Teray's MA thesis. With that, in terms of thinking about inherent pragmatism and avenues for radical action built into the game, do you think the game positions itself in the framework set by Saul Alinsky, which again I hope we post a link related to that in the Discord, as a way to contextualize our current global socio-political situation and provide manageable solutions in a digestible and entertaining way? So on the one hand, you need to inform people. On the other hand, you need to then sort of give folks a immediate, avenue for action. Do you think the game is able to do that?
Yeah, like I said before, not not on its own, and I don't think that any game on its own would be able to do that. But it can provide the ingredients for something that is potentially quite powerful. And as the questioner, I think, very well put it, there is that element of education or informing through the game. So the game gives you that global systemic perspective, and because it's focused on solutions, it also shows you what is possible, and what governments should do. So it kind of answers that question of like, what would I do if I were in charge, for instance. But then the game itself leaves that question open, and I think the next step is for people to use the whatever the game brought up, the that potential, and direct it towards either a more localized type of activism. And so I'm thinking, for instance, that if the game is played as a gateway to get to know other people that are doing things in a political local sense, that can be quite powerful. So the game can be almost like a gateway to get to know people who are already doing some work. And I think that's really the link. Like I said before, the game itself doesn't have to do all the work, but to if you spend 1 or 2 hours playing a game, solving climate change, and hopefully because you're cooperating with them, you might feel like you want to cooperate with them also on other problems that might be more local. So if that could be a tool for activists to recruit, in a way, more people into their campaigns or their work. Yeah.
Um, the next question is related to, I would say, Jesper Juhl's Art of Failure. Games are not just arts of agency, they're also about, how do we design people to fail? You mentioned that when they lost, players either blamed themselves or they blamed the game. I find it interesting that they didn't blame other players. Did that not happen during your playtests?
Yeah, yeah, it does happen actually. Um, yeah, so people do, when I say blame themselves, I don't mean necessarily themselves personally, but blame the play group. Although when if you get blamed by someone for a choice that you made, then probably you have also a couple of ideas about what you can blame about them, and that can be a very generative conversation. So yes, I observed it, um, and I think that it's a good thing. Like it's good when people start to blame themselves in that playful way around the choices that they made. And again, if that ends up being a catalyst for playing again, that's really good. Um, so when people analyze their choices and find things that could have been done differently, that's a that's a good result for me. Um, and yeah, like I said, I've seen those discussions happen, but they because it's cooperative, and people tend to take it in good spirit. I've not observed anyone being yeah, scarred by that experience, or blaming others and not wanting to play again because of that. It's generally taken as as an opportunity to debrief and decide what could be done differently.
I guess our last question for the day, from Atlas Quo on Discord, it's from a peek at your portfolio site. I see that you prefer to design cooperative games and also design serious games as playful consultations for organizations. Are the serious games you design for these organizations, organizational settings, always cooperative as well? What are some of the benefits or blind spots you've noticed from designing like this?
Yeah, I mostly design cooperative games, but I don't necessarily limit to cooperative games. I find that cooperative games are very useful when it comes to also serious games because they allow you to create that open conversation. So, actually, to backtrack, cooperative games with open communication, because not all cooperative games have that. Um, and I think that is a good place to start when you want to get people around a table or in a room to have a structured conversation around a shared problem. And of course, they could be coming to that problem from different perspectives with different interests. So that's where you can introduce elements of competition or different incentives that could pull people in different directions. But I think that, in a sense, okay, so you could say that every game is cooperative in that when you sit down around a table to play a game, you enter a social contract with other people, and even though you're competing with them to win the by the explicit rules, the overall experience is one where you agree to take care of each other in a sense. Um, so it's about bringing that understanding also to a serious game context. And even though the game itself may be set up to be explicitly competitive, so there are games where we tell people this is your goal, this is your goal, this is your goal. Maybe it's a secret, maybe it's not, and then you have to negotiate or you have to compete with other players. But ultimately, the goal is um, to solve a shared problem.
Yeah, and I think the issue is always balancing, sort of the utilitarian, like transformative potential of the games with, of course,
Mm.
your standard UI UX problems of how do people learn the rules, how do they do this well, and is this fun, and or is
Yeah,
this entertaining? And for serious games, that entertainment doesn't have to be the primary outcome, but if they don't want to do it, it's going to teach them less.
yeah. And yeah, for serious games that are probably not going to be played multiple times, you have a different set of challenges. So, as you said, what's important is that the game is as simple to learn as possible so that they can get started within 3 minutes. Because if someone comes to play a serious game, whether it's called a serious game or not officially, they don't want to spend too much time learning the rules of the game. They just want to see how that applies to their real world scenario or organization. And you can do a lot of that through facilitation. So you can kind of set the bare minimum of rules so that people understand broadly what they're meant to do, and then it's a process of discovery. So in a way, the user experience is more similar perhaps to what a video game would do, where you have the tutorial round where you guide people through the basic structure of the game while they're playing already. And that is something that you can typically do in a serious game where it's a facilitated experience, so you can include that in the design process.
Well, we are at the end of our time together, and so again, I once more want to thank you, Matteo, and also to the audience as well as to our interpreters, for the combined effort to make this an enjoyable hour together on the subject of Daybreak. Thanks so much. And again, you've got the links from Matteo on what's next, so follow him, and he will deliver. I absolutely believe that. All
Thank you.
right. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.